computer. There we go. Okay. Well, we got a few people coming in and starting to join us. And so it is being recorded right now. So if you're joining us on YouTube, hello, YouTubers. So hi, Austin. How are you?
Doing so well. So good to see you. Thanks for having us.
Good seeing you too. I'm so glad that you contacted us and that we're going to talk about who's got the book. To hold up the book real quick. Who's got one?
It's stuck. You know what? It's stuck
That's
in
right.
it's stuck in pandemic log jams.
That's right. That's right. So that's why. And if everybody's watching on YouTube, you're going to have to Google it because we're not in your comment section. But for everybody that's joining us on the webinar, I'm going to be putting in the comment section how to pre-order that book. And so we're going to do a pre-order for Wicked Problems from the Warwick's bookshop.org page, which is fantastic because you put the order in, it's going to get to you faster than if you would have even ordered it from Warwick. So I'll be putting that in a couple times. Sarah, hello. Welcome to Virtual Warwick. Where are you calling in from?
I'm in Montreal today, actually.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, spring has come.
Spring has come. So, and Ernesto, where are you joining us from?
Hi, I am joining you from South Bend, Indiana.
Okay, so we have kind
a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
A little bit of this because Austin and I are in San Diego. So what I always love about this, and this is why I still love doing the virtual events, because to get the three of you together for this in person, in real life, as they say, would have been probably nearly impossible. So that's why I just still love doing these virtual events and having everybody come in. And I think this conversation is going to be, it's timely, it's wonderful, and I can't wait for it. So just real quick for everybody who doesn't know that may be joining us, Warwick's is located in La Jolla, San Diego. A little sign there says 1896. We celebrated our 125th anniversary last year.
Wow.
And yeah, I know, pretty amazing. And part of what we do and what we're known for is bringing wonderful author events together. So we're so excited for this one. In the comment section, like I said, I'm going to put how to order Wicked Problems from bookshop.org Warwick's. But we also, the conversation today is going to be moderated by Sarah. Austin's going to do a little intro with everybody. They're going to talk amongst themselves for about 40-ish minutes. And then we're going to do some more Q&A. And so I love there's Austin saying hello to everybody. In the Q&A section, if you scroll over your screen, you're going to see a Q&A button. That's where we're going to look for, where they're going to look for questions that come in. So I'll be talking to you in the chat too. If I see something in the chat, I'm going to ask you to go put it into the Q&A because they'll see them a little bit easier there. So I think I've done my housekeeping here, folks. So with that, Austin, take it away. See you later.
I'm going to take it away. Thanks so much, Julie. This is the third book lunch we've done with you all, and it's always such a wonderful pleasure to be hosted by you all. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be chatting with you all this afternoon about this book. I'm especially grateful to be joined by my colleagues. This book, Wicked Problems, The Ethics of Action for Peace, Rights, and Justice, is coming out now with Oxford University Press, and you can order it through Works. And it's a co-edited effort by myself, our colleague, Douglas Irvin Erickson, who's an assistant professor at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, and wishes he could be here today, but he is earning amazing brownie points being an amazing father. It is also co-edited by Ernesto Verdeja, who is here with us today. He's my colleague at the University of Notre Dame, where he is an associate professor at the Kroc Institute. And sort of moderating this conversation is going to be Sarah Fetterman, who is an incoming associate professor of conflict resolution here at the Kroc School at the University of San Diego. And she's sort of a wonderful person to be having this conversation with for a number of reasons. She could have written this book, and in some ways she has. Her new book is Narrative and Mass Atrocity, Victims and Perpetrators in the Aftermath. That's coming out soon with Cambridge University Press, and she's done, I think, books of hers on the shelf behind me. And so she's going to be sort of moderating a conversation with Ernesto and I, in which she may ask questions she's better prepared to answer herself. So we're going to have a kind of a conversation here, I think, about the topics in the book. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah. Sarah, thanks so much for agreeing to do this.
Thank you. Thanks.
Welcome to California, even remotely.
Yeah, the thought of California gets you through a Montreal winter. Thank you for this invitation. It's really fun to see a book that would have been very helpful in grad school and for anybody kind of who's involved in messy problems. So I'm looking at this big bookshelf behind you, Austin, and I'm thinking, I'm looking at all my books, and you're so many great books in the world. Why another book? Why did this one need to be written? Can you tell us just a little bit about how it came to be and why now?
Yeah, I'll start off with that and then kick it over to Ernesto. The origin story for this conversation came with a conversation Ernesto, Doug, and I were having at a conference, yet another academic conference, talking about sort of highfalutin theoretical concepts. And what we kept running into in our chat was the importance of, I guess, ethics as an abstract concept, but actually something a bit more practical about the challenges that folks face on the ground when they take action for, as the title of the book says, peace, rights, and justice. Oftentimes we go out into the world to make it different than we find it, hopefully make it better. As soon as we take action, we find, the old adage, your battle plans never survive first contact with the enemy. Same is true for struggles for peace, rights, and justice. We've got into the world, we've got this great idea, and then all of a sudden reality happens because we started acting in the world. And so we really wrote the book to help folks wrestle in a very positive and solutions-oriented way with those sorts of ethical dilemmas that we face when we go out into the world. But that sort of doesn't answer the question, like, what's an ethical dilemma? What's a wicked problem? The title of the book. Ernesto, what you got there?
I think that's right. So we came together, we each have our own backgrounds in the peace studies and peace building world more broadly. But we came together because we were really trying to think through the nature of these very specific, sometimes context specific types of questions that nevertheless seems to consistently come up across all these different areas of peace and conflict practice and peace and conflict research. And so we call them wicked problems, which is a term that's been floating around a little bit. And we've repurposed it in this context, essentially to refer to ethical dilemmas. And what we mean by dilemmas in this context, or wicked problems, are effectively problems that don't have a straightforward or obvious superior solution, right? So there are all these different types of trade-offs that are involved, but nevertheless, one can't avoid them. Whether you're engaged in social movements activism on the ground in your particular society, or you're doing atrocity prevention work at the UN level, or you are dealing with organizing different types of human rights organizations globally or regionally or nationally, whatever it happens to be, you continue to face these types of challenges. So we were trying to create a space or a venue where we could bring in different interlocutors, different people who are kind of struggling through these types of questions, whether they're scholars or scholar practitioners, or especially people whom we refer to as practitioners, that is, people who are involved in these types of things day in, day out. And we wanted to create a space to be able to reflect on these questions a little bit more systematically, rather than just focusing on, here's a problem on humanitarian interventions, and here's another problem on racial justice movements, but trying to kind of take a step back and say, well, there are these ethical dilemmas that consistently come up in peace building work. So that was kind of the genesis of it. Yeah.
When you say it, of course, it makes so much sense. But one of, I think, the traps of peace, rights, and justice work is that you're doing it because you're coming up, or perceive yourself coming up against some great evil, and you're going to fight that evil, right? And so because of the horrible things that humanity can do, and so you kind of go into it with this moral clarity, and it gives you a lot of energy and a lot of purpose and a lot of direction. And I loved that phrase, like, kind of hope to sidestep some of these ethical dilemmas. And I do remember more than a few graduate students saying that they studied human rights and came to the peace building field because it was just like something they could believe in. Like, they weren't sure, everything else was confusing, but at least they knew this. And then the further you get into this field, you're like, oh my God, it's just as messy as the rest of the world. And some of the problems I've seen with that, and I'd love to hear you're challenging the way I see it, or adding to that list, which is, one, we can really get a lot of blind spots by doing that, by just thinking we're the good ones and we know the way to go. We're unprepared a little bit to face some of the dilemmas. And this is what I saw in some of the readings, that you kind of caught off guard. I didn't expect to see this problem. Right. And then now I have to deal with it. And I'm just like not morally prepared, which this book can help. And then we also feel that because we're good and we're not like them, that we can't use the tactics they use. And so sometimes we're choosing from maybe less powerful strategies than we might otherwise do. So that was kind of how it landed with me. How do you respond to that?
Ernesto, that's a hard question. Will you answer it, please?
Be so far as to say it's a wicked problem, if you will. No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Many people go into the world of peace building and human rights and advocacy work because of a strong and clear commitment to these really profound and human affirming values, right? And that's great. And that's what we want. We want people to be motivated by those things and be committed to them. But it's nevertheless the fact that when the rubber hits the road, so to speak, when you start engaging in this kind of work in a really sustained way, you find all sorts of difficult challenges and dilemmas and trade-offs. And you're asking yourself, well, for instance, do I privilege outcomes and trying to get results in the short term, even though that might have really problematic consequences in the long term or unknown consequences in the long term? Or how do I, for instance, try to work with people who are otherwise deeply problematic because of what they've done or the positions that they hold, but you kind of need that in order to bring about some minimal degree of peace? How do you balance these things, right? How do you trade off these different types of questions and do it in a way that still advances human rights and peace building, et cetera? So we're trying to kind of engage and really explore these types of questions in a way that doesn't resolve itself by simply saying, oh, the world is terrible, the world is really hard, there's no solutions, let's just be jaded, right? I mean, that's deeply problematic in and of itself. So we try to frame it in a way that allows each of the contributors to really explore these questions in terms of their own experiences or their own particular kind of research and scholarship and practice that they're engaged in, but at the same time, frame it in such a way that thinks about ethical dilemmas, both in terms of time. So, how do you balance questions in terms of the short term, the midterm, the long term, but also in terms of agents whom you work with, and also thinking about balancing different types of outcomes. So that's kind of the broad thinking of it. Austin, you probably have something more to say to this. We can also talk a little bit more concretely about it as well, because this is pretty general.
I'm going to say another abstract thing, and then we can get to concrete. But I feel like one of the tensions that proactive pro-social work faces is if we would go around and we ask the wise folks who know what the obstacles are and what the paths are around them, then we're not going to have new ideas. And in a lot of ways, this book for me came out of conversations with students and with people who want to make change and who are in some cases asking us sort of what's the right approach, what's the right strategy, choosing a strategy, taking action, and then running into, what you run into when you take action, which is variables and complexity and dilemmas. And what I want to do is somehow emphasize the importance of wrestling there with those tensions in order to persevere, learn, evolve, grow, adapt, and continue moving. Because if we go out into the world thinking there's a light switch to flip, and then when it doesn't flip, we bail, then we don't get to be part of the change that we're really committed to. And I'm not talking about any one particular kind of change. I'm saying this really broadly because all of us have areas where we want to make a difference. Just so happens that there's ethical dilemmas that we're more familiar with in, this peace, rights, and justice terrain. But I think some of the lessons here are around identifying who we are in the world, what the world is like, how we want to make a difference, and not getting frustrated, depressed, or wanting to peace out when we hit those obstacles for the first time. It's inviting us to reflection of bringing our best selves into that moment where we ask, okay, what now? And I really hope we the book inspires people to push on through that space. And there's some tools in the book for that as well.
Yeah, and just to kind of add a small thing to that, because you start off asking us, Sarah, like, why do we write this book? So just to be kind of really clear about that. One is because there's a lot of very good, sophisticated work on ethics and on moral reasoning that exists already. It's phenomenal. And my background is in political theory, which has a foot in philosophy. So I take that stuff very seriously. At the same time, there's a cluster of research and of work that's produced there that sometimes it's very hard to think about how to take a step from that very sophisticated abstract theorizing and connect it to all of these different myriad problems, right? So that's one area of scholarship that, while we find it quite fascinating, sometimes there's a disconnect there. And we felt that there was a gap in terms of addressing some of these practical peace building questions. The other thing that really informed this project and really kind of inspired us to do this is that there's a lot of very good work, again, on very specific questions, on humanitarian interventions, on racial justice movements, whatever it happens to be. But what we didn't see was a space where you could have people who deal with all sorts of ethical dilemmas or wicked problems across peace building come into one place and really reflect on these questions under one roof, so to speak, right? That's something we didn't see.
Yeah. And the word retreat is coming up in my mind, like not wanting people to retreat the moment that they hit a complexity, or that all of a sudden they might be morally compromised too. And now they've dirtied their hands and need to walk away from this and pick another project where they're not going to dirty their hands. Like, what's the purest work I can do? And instead move ahead. And what about you two in your own work? Was there something that you kind of came up against and were like, oh my gosh, like I didn't expect to find myself here?
Yeah, Austin, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. I think maybe if you've done this work for long enough, then there's this long list of things. You're like, all right, which of these is it going to be? Because this is so much of what taking normative action in the world where outcomes are underspecified, underdefined, ill-defined, where we're building the future together. All of those are worlds in which there is uncertainty about what's next. And when you find out what's next, there's uncertainty sometimes about what the right thing is to do. And so I think a signal example for me, and this isn't in the book, but is working with human rights groups that were transitioning folks in radical forms of exploitation out of the situation of exploitation and back out into the broader sort of socio-political and economic environment that they lived in. And what I realized pretty quickly is that the sort of thing on offer from emancipatory human rights efforts is only as good as it is able to also change that larger world, right? So I'm just being abstract here, but the concrete example is I was working with folks that were transitioning survivors of trafficking and slavery out of that form of exploitation and back out of that into the world. The question we've got to ask ourselves in radically unequal countries like the United States and India, the two places where I have experience here, is what is freedom for impoverished people in the absence of a state that will protect them, a community that surrounds them, neighbors who will look after them. So then the question becomes, if we are able to have interventions that move a person from one status to another, when the new status is some kind of like lack of equality, an unfreedom, if you will, then are we really pursuing sort of justice in the way that we think we are? It's a long answer, but the tension here is it then do we do nothing? No. Do we then stop doing things at the moment of exploitation where people's lives are sort of on the line and in order to change policy? Well, also no, right? So can we do everything? Also no. Right. So that for me, I've got my own answers to what I've done with that, but that I think was for me the most salient example of this at the earliest stage of my career, where I thought, wow, this thing I thought was easy is hard. And the bigger thing that's more that generates change at a larger level is systemic and structural, and that could take a lifetime. So which is it? Both? Neither? All right, I'm gonna stop talking because I'm just gonna go around in that circle. Ernesto, say something clearer than that.
I love it's clearer than that. My own experience is actually from a pretty different space in, broadly speaking, the human rights world. So coming from a different set of questions and different set of cases and backgrounds. I've done a lot of work in the atrocity prevention world. So thinking about genocide and mass atrocities like war crimes and crimes against humanity, worked in some human rights organizations that deal with those questions. And I continue to do work with various NGOs and governments on prevention work. And so for me, one of the things that's always struck me is how, even though we have very clear norms and values and international laws prohibiting all of these these terrible atrocities, there are, in fact, these really profound and difficult, wicked problems to navigate. And they come up consistently in the face of mass atrocity scenarios. So some of them, for instance, concern how do you sit down and how much do you negotiate with people who are human rights abusers and major violators in order to secure a ceasefire, right? But you do this sometimes perhaps at the expense of the rights of victims and of survivors. There are all these different types of trade-offs. That's one cluster of things that comes up in the atrocity prevention world. Another one has to do with questions of naming and prioritizing. What cases do we prioritize in the so-called international community and say, these are major atrocities. This is like the Holocaust, or this is like Rwanda. Right. But when we say that, we also leave off all the Cameroons and the Burundis and even the Yemens of the world, right? So we have these moral inequities and prioritizations. And it's a dilemma because, of course, you don't want to say that you shouldn't focus on the ones that are already recognized. You don't want to say, well, we shouldn't focus on that because there's just other cases that are being ignored. It's a dilemma because human rights prevention work and atrocity prevention work and all this stuff is necessary. It's needed, but there's a limited bandwidth of attention, limited number of resources, and anyone involved in this world has to balance these different questions in order to advance human rights. So I can go into a whole bunch of those. I actually have a chapter on it in the book. And again, the idea is not to come away from this saying like, oh, well, therefore it's all impossible. These things just happen. You can't do anything. Instead, it's like, well, these are, as I see it, constitutive problems of atrocity prevention and of human rights practice. They constitute the very domain of how we think of this prevention type of work.
And to get people to pay attention to human rights and the different issues and mass atrocities that you're talking about, all the different ones, you often have to form a more simplistic story of what happened. And so in order to get the attention you need to do that, but then you can buy into that story yourself. And then if you start to play in or people start to poke, it turns out your victim has also had a sullied past, and your hero is not so perfect. And then you're back in to the real mess of it. You can only hold that kind of picture perfect frame. Austin, I interrupted you.
I was going to ask you, Sarah, this is I feel like half of your work is on wicked problems.
Yeah.
I mean, what's your answer to this? That's Ernesto and I.
I went in, very excited what brought me to this work was actually seeing my own name on a Holocaust memorial wall when I was living in Paris. And I started getting interested in the role of the French national railways in the Holocaust. And then I found out there was a conflict in France and in the United States over whether or not the company had done enough to make amends. This is now a very common theme, right? There's lots of institutions being asked to atone. And at the time I was so angry, right? This company would have taken my family. It would have murdered me. It murdered someone with my name. So it felt like it murdered me. And then I started to study the war and I was like, God, did they really have much say? And wow, there were 500,000 people working at that company, more than all US airlines combined. And some of them were involved in the deportations and most, some were involved in the resistance and most did nothing. And so there were so many problems. The more I studied it, I didn't know whose side I was on because I interviewed anybody who had a perspective on the conflict and I kept changing. And then the problem of where does the soul of a corporation lie when all the people who did the deeds are dead? So there were survivors didn't agree. This was the other thing. The newspapers would just interview survivors who were for the train, against the train company and people who were for the train company. But there were all these people in the middle and I wasn't prepared for them because the news was more binary. So yeah, the book I wrote, Last Train to Auschwitz, talks about this and actually got California involved because it was the high-speed rail pitch that the train company got involved in there. But yeah, I felt like the conflict taught me about conflict. Ultimately, I thought I was going to help, and I'm not sure I did.
Yeah, I'm familiar with your work. I think it is actually extremely important because it brings a sense of the complexity of these questions. But what it does is it helps move us away from searching for the problem isn't simple answers, it's simplistic answers, right?
That's right.
Some problems have
and uniform answers.
And uniform answers. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet one doesn't want to fall into such a trap of so much sensitivity to nuance and context and circumstance, et cetera, that the normative element, the normative dimension is lost.
That's right.
But the problem here is we're talking about all sorts of issues of scale over, in the case of what you're talking about, number of people involved in a corporation like this, number of actors, but also scale over time. Yeah. And it introduces this just enormous complexity, but nevertheless, there has to be a response because otherwise there's no accountability.
So that, in fact, it's these wicked problems that made me want to write about narratives of mass atrocity in this other book, because I brought other people around working in post-conflict zones saying, what are you finding in Bangladesh? And what are you finding in Uganda? And what are you finding in Rwanda? And what are you finding in Bolivia? And we did all these different countries. I'm like, is it as messy over there as it is over here? And they were like, yeah, it's really complicated in the aftermath. But I think the complexity, Ernesto, that you're talking about actually helps people in the aftermath with reconciliation. If you leave it be messy, but if you put them in these binary groups, it's problematic. And I'm sure, in some of your work, Austin, some people didn't always make their situations better for themselves and contributed to ways in their own problems, which also complicated them as characters. There are some really fascinating entries and contributions to this book. And I have a few that stuck out to me, but I'd love to hear from you too when you were working on it. And I know you love them all and they're all your favorite. But if there's one that just sticks with you or that you find yourself thinking about in the days since you've kind of put the book together.
Yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'm going to talk about sort of the contributions in general, and then I think punt to Ernesto on that detailed question. One of the things we're setting out to do, as I hope is clear from the way we're talking about this, is to find contributions that were from academics, from scholar practitioners, and from activists and practitioners. And these are like short, punchy 4,000 words sort of interventions, if you will, that are dilemma centric. So what it's not is an exegesis on a particular academic topic or a deep exploration of a philosophical approach. These are people writing like, well, there I was, and here was the dilemma, and here's what happened next. Because I started out by saying we want this to be useful in helping people to imagine themselves in someone else's shoes and then imagining solutions. And we want this to be sort of solutions and forward thinking oriented, while recognizing solutions aren't like there's no button to push, there's only the struggle, right? And so this is how we went out to find people, and we started finding folks who we only worked with folks who had a dilemma that they could speak about in the first person and write about and wrestle with in a way that felt concrete to us, and we would feel confident sort of handing off to other folks and saying like, look at this, it's short, it's sweet, you can read it. So I'll answer for myself. I mentioned that I got my start in this, sort of my founding dilemma in this conversation was this moment where you realize emancipation is not all it's cracked up to be in radically unequal societies. And so one of the chapters here is from a colleague of mine named Min Dang, who runs something called the Survivor Alliance in the UK, and she's at the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham, where I have an affiliation. And she writes about what it means to be a survivor of exploitation and the leader of a movement and a network of survivors, and the tensions that creates for folks who have multiple identities and for folks for whom the ongoing work of social change is complicated, and then invites the reader into sort of look, this is what allyship looks like, and these are the complexities of doing this work as a survivor leader, her term. And so that is not a chapter I could have written. It is not a chapter most people could have written, but the way she writes it, short, engaging, and sort of, bringing us right into the dilemma and asking us to sit with her in it, is sort of not applicable to everyone, but it's like this really engaging thing that we can all sort of get our brains around in some ways. So I think that's there's a bunch of chapters here. Ernesto's good at the whirlwind tour, but I think every one of them has a similar sort of dilemma at its heart.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating chapter. And it really brings up a number of provocative issues that, much like Austin, I don't think I could have even quite conceived or articulated that problem. Wouldn't be the first thing I would turn to. And nevertheless, once you read that chapter, you realize, oh, okay, this is a really profound ethical dilemma. I'll say something about a couple of chapters that stand out for me, but maybe one thing worth identifying or talking a little bit about is kind of how the book is structured, what we're trying to do with it, right? So the book basically has a bunch of different contributors, as Austin already mentioned. And what we did was, as we were struggling with and thinking about how to organize in a somewhat coherent way the different contributions, we divided the book broadly in kind of three big areas. They're not completely exclusive of one another, but they have different emphases. So some of the chapters pull in one direction rather than the other. And as Austin mentioned, of course, there are people who are full-time practitioners and people who are kind of scholar practitioners and kind of fall in these different spaces and gaps. We were really interested, for instance, in having a very diverse set of contributors. So people at the very forefront of various intersectional justice movements, whether LGBTQ or racial justice efforts or women's rights efforts, et cetera. Also people focusing on struggles in the United States, but also in other parts of the world and all of these different kind of analytical levels. So we have a number of contributions at the beginning on the perennial question of peace building, which is violence, right? Do you use violence? Under what conditions is it justified or not? I'm not going to go into any detail about those, but I will say that the book starts off with a bang with this really sophisticated chapter by a contributor named Tony Gaskew, who is an African-American former police officer and now scholar, now a professor and academic, who makes a really provocative set of claims about the uses of violence in the American context for African-Americans who suffer really kind of significant amounts of violence by the state. So he has a really interesting take on that. I'm not going to give away the punchline, so to speak, but it comes out of the Black radical tradition. So we have a number of different chapters on the uses of violence and thinking about transformative versus say reformist approaches to change. We have a different section dealing with leadership in organizations. Min Dong's chapter is in there as well, thinking about this kind of fraught issue about leadership. So there's a really interesting chapter that really stood out for me by a former colleague and friend and current friend, I shouldn't say former friend, Dan Myers, who talks about as being kind of a cis straight white man as having been involved in LGBTQ rights issues and risen to a leadership position, and really fascinating questions about how identity and representation and leadership work in these types of justice efforts. It's very thoughtful, very reflective, uncomfortable for him, which I think says a lot about his ability to reflect on it. And nevertheless, he has these strong normative commitments. So a whole bunch of interesting chapters dealing with leadership in organizations. And then finally, another cluster that deal with what we refer to as systems and institutions. So thinking about institutional actors. I mean, in some of these ways, dealing with the types of questions that you're interested in your work on the train company, right, Sarah, in France, and the role of businesses, but dealing with how do we approach the fact that you have all of these forms of systemic injustice and big institutions with whom one has to work. They can be both the drivers of injustice, but they're also necessary players at the so-called table. You need to work with them. So in my own work on atrocity prevention, you have to work with the US, France, and Great Britain. Right. They're major defenders of human rights and also major drivers of human rights violations and injustices. We have a long list of those cases, right? So that kind of gives a sense, hopefully, to some of the folks about what's in the book, but it also gives you a sense of kind of the varied nature of topics that we kind of cover.
Yeah, and one other that you have in there just that I'm finding is very relevant is problematizing sanctions, and sanctions actually being extension of canceling, right? And, if we cancel everything, we got nothing. Like if I have to cancel every brand and everything I eat and I'm just all by myself, and you can't influence what you cancel, right? And so, but at the same time, there are cases for, there's times to boycott. There's a, there's a time for boycotting. There's a time for engaging. It's a Song of Solomon all the way. Yeah, that's quite, that one I thought was quite powerful.
Can I piggyback on this real quickly? Because this chapter, I think I've been thinking about the salience of this chapter. This is the question. It's a chapter from our colleagues George Lopez and Beatrix Guillen-Bernier, and it's wrestling with whether or not after sanctions, the folks who levied the sanctions owe the folks who got sanctioned not reparations, but some sort of financial repair to undo the harm that were the result of the sanctions. And this is, they're writing about a case from 5 years ago, and we're going to be having this conversation for the next 5 years. And it's a great question, but it's not currently one that's being discussed, because we're doing our best, I think, as an international community to figure out, well, when do sanctions happen? And then we do our best to say that was not the best we could have done. So it's a constant sort of conversation about this as a policy intervention, but very little about what happens after the fact. It's seen as a forward-acting, prescriptive thing that's meant to cease harm. And if the harm ceases, we don't have a new question about what kind of harm was the result of the sanctions. And so what this chapter does, and I don't think this is the way they frame it, but in my mind, it pushes our ethical commitments. It asks what we owe one another into the future. And so then the policy implication here would be, if you're going to set aside money to sort of backfill things that are lost as a result of sanctions for the folks doing the sanctioning, maybe you put money in escrow that's just waiting there for when the folks who are doing the sanctioned behavior come off the naughty list, and then there's funding for repair. A Marshall Plan at the other end of sanctions is not a sentence we're accommodated to, because it's not an argument that's necessarily out there, but this chapter pushed my thinking about what happens after sanctions. And it's not a rocket science sort of like leap to ask what should happen after this kind of conflict, but it draws lessons. It draws new lessons into an example that I don't think I've seen them in before.
Yeah, I like
that. Thanks for bringing that chapter.
Yeah, and it kind of says, well, okay, so maybe the ends justify the means, but then you have to deal with the means. The idea is, and that's kind of what you're saying. Yeah, like what's the effect of the means? Like, okay, so where's the harm now? And now we go deal with that one, and now we go deal with that one, and it's just looking at where the harm is. even in the sensitive world of sharing a victim story and being a journalist and asking somebody questions. Like I have really noodled over the question of the ethics of working with genocide testimony, not just how it's collected, but then how it's used and the voyeurism with that. And we haven't talked about all of those things, but you've made space in a lot of these. And I felt like in reading them, and that, well, if I haven't experienced this conundrum, I'm sure I know someone who has. Right? Like I didn't feel, sometimes we think of this work, or at least I did in the work that I did, of like, it's faraway places. These are conflicts in faraway places that I don't understand. But actually the ethical dilemmas have resonance. I mean, in our society and in many spaces, as you say, in leadership and institutions, as well as in violence.
Yeah. And, what's interesting, that brings up some questions that actually come up in two of the chapters towards the end of the volume. One is this really fascinating chapter by Elizabeth Hume and Jessica Baumgardner-Zuzak, who talk about the need for standards of research ethics when you're working in the field. And they've been working through this for a long time through their work with the Alliance for Peace Building. And they really kind of work through this because they talk about how we have all these technical standards for how to do research, questions of inference and methodology on the ground, and even securing and protecting data, et cetera. That stuff's pretty sophisticated. You learn that as a researcher, whether you're in academia or if you're working at an NGO that kind of privileges and prioritizes these things, you'll learn that. But the ethical dimensions of it is something that requires more and more attention. And they try to work through it. And I think they do a really admirable job at addressing these questions that otherwise can kind of be lost. And then another chapter that struck me as really fascinating as well. I am a professor, I work in human rights and I work with human rights organizations, but I am primarily a professor, just like the two of you. And there's this great chapter at the end by Agnieszka Pajinska and Susan Hirsch on teaching, right?
Yeah.
And how do we teach students to really think about doing research, but also thinking about what it means to go into the field or however that happens to be constructed, and really do the kind of work that they want to do, but also be thoughtful and reflective, and not assume that just because you have the right intentions means that you're gonna get the right answers, right? Because you can step over a lot of people in the process of doing that. It's a really fascinating chapter on teaching.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that's an important one to highlight as well. Written by two of my mentors. So
yeah, right. So yeah, it's a small world, right? I mean,
yeah. So I mean, Susan Hirsch was a doctoral chair of mine, pushing me on all kinds of moments with the trains. And one of the beautiful things about being in a doctoral program is you run into ethical dilemmas, and then you run to the office next to you and your faculty, and you're like, like, what do I do now? And this book, I think, can create that space for the conversation. Should we take a couple? Yeah, go ahead, Austin.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I wanted to have one quick last round, and I know we probably need to get to Q&A soon, but I want to have one last round and chat a little bit about what we think about the fact that peace, rights, and justice have all been added, are all in this mix. And so I feel like this is, all three of us now are working at Joan B. Kroc funded ecosystems where she invested money into building a ecosystem of peace building folks focused on a particular set of normative commitments. And with this title, we have some, I don't know what the right way to, strange bedfellows, probably not the right way to say it, but we've got folks who are not always in the same volume together. So I'm just riffing here off of this, like, oh, this was my mentor, my PhD. So there are some, if you come from a field or another, there are some names you might recognize, but this admixture is unique. So I guess my first question maybe for Sarah is, how did that land for you when you first, we talked about you hosting this and you cracked the cover and you read the table of contents and you thought, like, what did that look like? And Ernesto, what does it mean? Those are my two questions.
Well, it's fun. I mean, it's just more people in different spaces that I'm not inhabiting. Like one of the reasons why reading is fun. I can't live every life. And I'm like, oh, what are you stuck with? Like, what are you working on? I care about all these issues. How are you going about it? And then not always agreeing with how they go about it, but being like, well, hey, like, I'm not in it. Like you're living a different story than I am. And like, let me hear it. So I feel like I loved the diversity of pieces, topics, and places that people situate. I don't think wisdom comes in any particular location, right? It comes from people all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I want to jump to the question. I think there's some fantastic ones though.
Yeah.
But just riffing off of what Sarah was just saying, I think one of the reasons why I wanted to create this space to have different folks come together and be able to reflect and think through, and some of the chapters are very systematic, others are a little bit more reflective. But to have this kind of space is because we also realize that in certain areas, people are kind of reinventing the wheel, right? So it's not only that they're dealing with different difficult, wicked problems and ethical dilemmas, et cetera, but they're also in the process of trying to work through these and navigate these types of questions. And yet you find it happening kind of in parallel almost, in kind of a siloed way. And there's a lot that can be learned from just seeing how other people have struggled with these questions. There's a great chapter by Raina Neufeld, who is, it's just phenomenal peace scholar and peace practitioner. And she's done a lot of work on reflective practice. Her chapter has this great way of just laying out the domain and the range of different types of challenges and how to address these things in a nuanced, thoughtful, reflective way, but at the same time that is philosophically rigorous. So for me, it was a way of kind of bringing together different types of people and seeing that sometimes, even though the wheel is being reinvented, so to speak, there's a lot to learn, and we don't have to start from the first step, so to speak. But
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah. Sorry.
So should we, this is great. We take some of the questions. Were there, you said there were some great ones. There's one that you wanted to start with, Ernesto, then you.
Oh gosh, I don't know. First of all, it's just really nice to see in the Q&A and in the comments, just generally, I feel like there's new friends, really lovely people saying hi, and also some folks I know. So it's really a nice combination of people. I thought maybe I'll take a stab at the first one by Daniel Leonard. And I think it's a really great question. I'm going to kind of reframe it a little bit. So the question basically is, can you speak to the problems in which the solutions aren't particularly messy or confusing, but the actors are corrupt, and so conflict is protracted, right? So the example of gun control in the US, which is this perennial nightmare question in the United States. I would actually frame it a little bit differently, because even in those types of situations where some of the actors might be corrupt or they're unwilling to change their behavior, it is a wicked problem, because you're forced or confronted with negotiating and having to achieve a solution with folks who have very different perspectives from you. I think of this from the perspective of atrocity prevention, where you have to sit down with major perpetrators of human rights, but in order for them to lay their guns down, they want all sorts of immunity and protection. Otherwise, they keep fighting and keep killing, right? So how do you navigate that? Well, the problems are pretty straightforward, that what the solution is, but the fact that you have to negotiate with these folks, that's where the wicked problem, the knotty ethical question comes in. So to me, there often are embedded these wicked problems. And in fact, it gets at the heart of the book in that we may think that the solutions are rather straightforward. We know in the United States, in terms of gun control, what would work. There's good research on it. We know what needs to be done in order to minimize significant amounts of domestic gun violence, right? So we have policy outlines for this. There's research underpinning it. And yet the political problem is so profound that effectively it presents itself as an ethical dilemma. So that's my thought on that. I don't know if others want to take a shot at it, or if you want to kind of move forward a little bit.
Good.
Yeah, that's good. Can I address Wes's question?
Sure.
Great question from Wes Watson. Hey, Wes, good to see you. Thanks for being here. His question is, what was the biggest surprise from your research? Any key aha takeaways you didn't expect going into the project? One of the things that I think we've sort of referred to offhandedly or gestured toward is the fact that this really is we've got voices from peace building, voices from the sort of conflict resolution world, voices from the human rights world, and then also voices from sort of coming out of contemporary social movements. And so it's social movements that have been in the headlines over the last 5 years, sort of thing. And what's been interesting to me is to be able to sort of these have traditionally been separate channels. Like you could switch on the radio and you could pick up on any of these channels. But what it did is it brought all of those sort of, I'm gesturing toward my screen, it brought these so you could sort of look across them and notice similarities in in complexities and in these sort of these dilemmas, these wicked problems. And that was interesting. That was a real kind of moment for me in recognizing how there are similarities that cut across these different flavors of normative action, normative commitments. And then another thing we did, that's sort of what we got. And then what we kind of did with it was scaled it. And Ernesto gestured toward this earlier, but looking at both, dilemmas of violence, also sort of what about leadership and organization, stuff that's, we can look out and see and it's right around us and involves us perhaps. And then also systems and institutions that are just a different scalar level, bigger and more sophisticated, abstract, harder to change, slow moving, difficult to see. And so it was almost like this strange, cool space where you had people talking in slightly different vernaculars from across that, that radio dial, and about different problems at slightly different levels. And you can see how some of these challenges just are persistent across all of them. Mm-hmm. And so we didn't set out to do like a compare and contrast and to count, and to do some sort of estimation of how many people have what sorts of problems, not that kind of study. But it was really interesting to me to bring those different voices into one book, and then to be able to read across those perspectives.
Can I loop Mujir and Ezra's interesting question into right where Austin left off? Because it's an interesting comment about, is it paradoxical to distance? I want to read it because there's a part of it. Is it paradoxical to distance ourselves from the problem while the wickedness of these issues seems to have been with us for millennia? So that's the first part. And let me start with that. And then she actually says, if we start with the human factor in the equation, human factor capitalized, I don't know if that has a particular meaning to you all. And then do you talk about that in the book? But this idea of this, are they so wicked, almost like they're new, and we're talking about them almost as if we're uncovering them, but they've been here for so long.
It sounds like a philosophical question. Ernesto, you're a philosopher, or you play one on TV.
Yeah, well, that's pretty rough if I'm the default philosopher. Okay, I think it is actually a really profound set of questions. On the one hand, there is a certain paradox of the distancing, right? And psychologists refer to a bystander effect, but moral philosophers also refer to a moral bystanding effect, whereby we become somewhat numb or disinterested in harms that are happening around us or elsewhere. And it's a way of ensuring a kind of moral protection and psychological well-being. And of course, the thing about a bystander effect in the context that I'm talking about is that bystandership actually facilitates the commission of harms. So it's not just perpetrators who commit harms, but bystanders, people who don't intervene, et cetera. So when we distance ourselves and we say, I don't really want to deal with this, I don't want to talk about it, we help facilitate or create a condition where these types of harms and violences can continue. And there's all sorts of different examples we could bring up. The ones I'm most familiar with, of course, involve genocide and mass atrocity. That's my world. Sarah knows these examples very, very well as well.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
It's funny. It's so fun to hear where you came at that question, because I walked into that question from a different door. I just see, well, not that all makes sense what you say. And what I was thinking of, I thought, well, there's a way in which the vernacularization of human rights is fairly new-ish in the human experience. The Genocide Convention, responsibility to protect, right? So the responsibility to recover in the aftermath of sanctions is like building on a responsibility to protect, which grows out of a Genocide Convention, which is all fairly new. So while, being human has been complicated since the beginning, and there have been trade-offs and all the myths, right, and all the sacrifices, some of the problems that you're articulating in this book is actually an approach to problem solving and a value set, a collective value set, and a collective accountability and responsibility that is fairly new. Ideas that institutions need to atone. That's not like, I don't think I find that in the Bible, right? There's no Greek myth about that one. So, maybe there is. Someone will correct me on that. But yeah, I don't know if that resonates with you. I mean, it's your book, but I was thinking that what I'm seeing is kind of this, we know the answer. We've got it. We know how we're going to save the world. And then it's actually complicated again.
I mean, this is why it's so nice to have you in this conversation, right? You're absolutely right. The framing of these types of issues in the way in which we do it today over the last 100-ish years, or World War II and post-World War II, is a bit different from how it was done beforehand, at the risk of massive oversimplification. But the fact is, the UN Declaration of Human Rights and these types of texts, they have a particular historical situatedness. And so they make these ethical dilemmas and these types of harms and wrongs, they put them on the table in a way that wasn't quite framed in the same way in the past. It wasn't quite done in the same way. At the same time, we face another dilemma, which is how do we confront all of this? How do we kind of navigate all of this? So this great philosopher, Lawrence Langer, talks about how, as a critique of responses to mass atrocities, he talks about how sometimes we think that the problem is just we need more knowledge. If we only knew what was happening in Rwanda at the time, we could have been, et cetera. And he talks about how what we really need is an alarmed vision. That's his language. So a vision which has a kind of moral or ethical sensitivity to it. And the dilemmas that we deal with here actually go a step beyond that, because the problem is that you can't cultivate an alarmed vision in a sustained way for all cases of harms all of the time.
Yeah.
It's just, we don't have the moral bandwidth as individuals to do that. So this is why we have laws and we institutionalize, we have a responsibility to protect, et cetera. So yes, we do address these questions in the book, just to kind of get to the question. We address this because in a lot of ways you can read the chapters and the responses in the books as trying to navigate what can be overwhelming on the face of it, overwhelming sets of ethical dilemmas and harms, and do it in a way that is proactive and forward-looking, that advances justice and human rights and peace building. There are practical elements to that. Yeah.
That loops into our colleagues'
Yes,
question. Yeah, Nejla was asking us any advice on the tension to act or not to act, or between paralysis by analysis. So that's back to the more information question, right? To do no harm and how to overcome it. So you know, do you take the Zen, wait for the murky waters to settle before you act, or?
Well, starting point is that the waters will never settle completely, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes they're a little clearer than other times, but they're never going to be crystal clear. I mean, if only, right? But I think there are a few chapters that speak to it. But Austin, I feel like you're about to say.
No, I was going to actually ask you. I've got my eye on the clock, and I was going to ask you, sort of like, take us home with an answer to the sort of the big framing of Nejla's question, which is, in some ways, are there tools for action? I mean, is the book all dilemmas, and we find everybody in how many chapters? There's 17 chapters, 17 little cul-de-sacs, just kind of like stuck there, or is this something where we're at an intersection and then we have a decision, we can keep moving? So I think this is where you're about to go, Ernesto, but end us on a high note in terms of what this does for us in sparking our moral imagination, strengthening our vision for how we can act with integrity in low information contexts where our action is needed.
Yeah, so I just want to say it's not 17 chapters of just utter sadness and crushing.
I didn't say that. I didn't say that. Well, I said it's not. Come on, give us some hope here.
We'd like to think it's not. But I think there are a few chapters that deal with these things from different perspectives, right? So one chapter, for instance, by Ashley Bohr, which I think is just a phenomenal chapter. Ashley Bohr is a philosopher and a human rights activist here in the United States. She's actually at the Kroc Institute with me at Notre Dame. She has this great chapter that deals with how to respond to harm, either from a prefigurative or from a reduction approach when it comes to mobilization. So prefigurative, the idea being that you act in such a way now in order to make real, to instantiate the way things ought to be. So it's not reformist. It's not about alliance building or negotiating, et cetera. It's a much stronger ethical commitment and a much clearer one. But at the risk of not always taking seriously kind of contingency in the situation you find yourself in. So she does this really fascinating, she produces this really fascinating chapter, which talks about how even framing it as prefigurative, the way I just talked about it, versus reformist approaches really misrepresents the nature of these types of social mobilization efforts. She talks about how you have to go back and forth. She uses Audre Lorde and some other thinkers from a feminist and kind of intersectional approaches, kind of radical thinkers, to talk about how she takes a couple of cases. She talks about how you can kind of navigate, you go back and forth. And sometimes in the morning, as she says, sometimes in the morning you have to be at the court of law and using the law in order to advance human rights. And in the afternoon, you have to fight against the injustice of the legal system as such. We have a couple of chapters that deal with these things in very practical ways. Ashley Bohr's chapter is great like this. Dina Hurwitz, who is an attorney and works on human rights issues, particularly in the occupied territories of Palestine, talks about what it means to be a lawyer who works with human rights and the law, but also pushes back against unjust laws. Those are two examples. I can come up with several others that actually lay the stuff out.
Yeah, and there's actually another way to, and to Nejla's question too, another way in, as I was thinking about how sometimes violence, dignity violations, ethical quandaries, they can leave us in paralysis. And actually, it's having the space to be able to talk about them that is the beginning of the untying of it, right? By actually laying it out. And this actually is a conversation that we actually can talk about. And that's what I see you doing in each of these chapters, opening up a room. Oh, we can talk about this. We can talk about this. And then movement can come from that, right? But you can't if you can't even speak of it as being a conundrum. So
I think that's like, can we like end on that? Because I feel like that's the thing we were hoping for, is starting conversations. And so we're hoping this book gets picked up by folks who are able to, read a short chapter on somebody's, on sort of that intersection where somebody had, we could have done a choose your own adventure where you read like, just read just up to the point and says, what would you have done? And then you turn the page to find out. But that's really how we want the book to get read, in a constructive, proactive, as I said earlier, sort of, moral imagination, enlarging sort of approach, which helps people to think about new ways to continue pursuing the objectives that they have for peace, rights, and justice, as opposed to hitting these challenges and getting bogged down.
So at the risk of interrupting you, and I did, and I can do that because we're co-editors. Austin,
and
can
we're
you
friends.
say
We're also friends.
It's a wicked problem. So Austin, can you say something about who the audience and kind of how we envision, who could read this book? I mean, we're doing this with Warwick precisely because we didn't want it to just be another academic book on an academic panel with academics in the audience.
Yeah. So this is and I'll wrap with thanks and a throw to Julie, but this is exactly why we're doing it here. And this is exactly why for the last 2 years, this book has taken a long time to put together during the pandemic. We've been really hammering at what exactly is the challenge? What is the story it's nested in? What's the way that the reader can really be drawn into this moment, in this dilemma with the person writing the book? That may sound really, really smart and common sense to most of the people listening, but it's not always how academics write. And so we really worked hard to make sure that while there is the scholarly apparatus around this, there's footnotes and, and citations, this is really written in a way that's meant to bring activists into conversations where they have had experiences that, like, to see some of their experiences where they may have thought that they were the only one in deciding whether or not to accept funding from an outside actor and wondering, is this funding going to help us to continue to, like, is the rubber going to keep hitting the road if we take this funding? Am I the right person to lead this organization? I need allies. Are these the right ones? If I actually make this kind of decision, am I selling out? Those are, I'm coming from the social movement perspective. So there's all the sort of kinds of dilemmas that I'm most familiar with. But to ask this question again across struggles for peace, rights, and justice that many people are engaged in at the grassroots, at the front lines, not sitting in libraries, not sort of asking, what's the next thing I should be citing, but saying, I want to go into this thing and I want to learn some lessons and I want to hear some stories and I want to sort of expand my imagination about how we can continue in an optimistic, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will sort of way that's really forward-looking and forward-driving. So the answer then is, who's the book for? Well, for people who are taking action intentionally and want to be circumspect about what that entails and to read stories of other people's experiences in similar kinds of spaces and to come out the other end with hope and some tools. I think.
And mic drop. That's about perfect.
That is a mic drop. What a great conversation. And Austin and Ernesto and Sarah, I'm so glad, Austin, that you brought this to us. I think it's an important topic. It's an important book. And so hopefully there will be lots of lay people like myself buying it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. There's the link is in the chat. If you buy this, then the money gets its way to an independent since 18 what, Julie?
96 there.
1896. So like and subscribe, give these good folks your money, and thank you all so much for coming. Over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you also, Sarah, for joining us and for hosting this and being part of the conversation. Thank you, Julie. Thanks everyone in the audience. Great questions.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.